Yeah, that was excellent. Okay, we have time for just one or two more questions. Dr. Lindsey, are some of those questions there, some that you would like to address?
Here's a question that shows a misunderstanding, and I've tried to say this before, but I'm not sure it's been clear enough. Is it correct that of the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew is the only one who had contact with Jesus or first-hand knowledge? Why would he use Mark and Luke as a source and others? The point of this is that our Gospel of Matthew in our text, a canon text, is not the writing that is being referred to evidently by Papias and some of the early church fathers as the work of Matthew. That is to say, we have an ancient tradition that goes back and says Matthew wrote the things of the Lord first in Hebrew, and everyone attempted to translate or interpret them as best he could. That's the old quotation from Papias about 135 A.D. Now that can only be a Hebrew version of the life of Jesus. That scheme that I've put on the board fits, in my judgment, that tradition. And the things that we are finding in our scriptures fits that tradition. That is, originally, the original Matthew wrote down the things of our Lord in Hebrew. And I think I've got personally a lot of excellent evidence that this man knew the Old Testament well, knew Hebrew well, and was with Jesus. He was an eyewitness with Jesus, and our eyewitness tradition goes back to this original Matthew. However, in the 2nd century, when the texts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that we know, and John, were being put together and being brought into the reading of by the people, and finally into a canon around 200 A.D., and maybe even earlier, what happened was they said, who wrote this book that we now call Matthew? What is that book? And so the name Matthew came to it. It may be because in Mark and Luke, the man called Levi is called Matthew in our Gospel of Matthew. Someone suggested that a long time ago, and that may very well be. In any case, it's very clear from a study of the Greek text of Hebrew of the Gospel of Matthew that it cannot be a man who understood his text when he as coming from Hebrew. That is, he made certain changes that were Greek changes that show he knows Greek, but not that he knew these texts had overtones of Hebrew. So what this really says is, how can Mark and Luke use the original Matthew as a source? Or rather, how can Matthew use Mark and in a way Luke? I didn't say he uses Luke directly. I said he uses Mark. He does not use Luke. He uses another text that is before Luke, that text that I've spoken of up there. Now, this simply means that our text of Matthew in our Gospels is called Matthew, but it's not the original Matthew. The original Matthew was in Hebrew, and our text in Greek is written by someone whose name has come to it as called Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, like we have the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, and it has been he has been thought to be Matthew, but he's not really the original Hebrew Matthew. Now, if that makes trouble for someone, just remember that the names came to our Gospels in the 2nd century, not as far as we know in the 1st century. I believe the tradition that John Mark wrote the 2nd Gospel is true, and that one, or what we call the 2nd, and that Luke is a true author of the present Gospel of Luke. But Matthew, our Gospel of Matthew, is certainly not written by the original Matthew. What we have is remnants of that story that Matthew wrote, and they've come down to us in Greek.
Dr. Lindsey, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes, and I think this might